Hey, this is Covenant Fellowship's Community Group Fellowship Series. The goal of the series is to highlight our need for fellowship and to help lead us into meaningful and effective fellowship with one another. I do hope this series serves your community group and serves you in your personal walk with Christ. This is the last of our 4 installments in our series on fellowship. Tonight, we close the series by focusing on fellowshipping on purpose. I've always thought the life of a farmer would be a challenging one. There's never an end to the work that needs to be done. You work hard, and listen, if you've ever seen them, they work very hard. And you're still so dependent upon the sun and the rains to produce the harvest you need to provide for your family. Farming is a life of faith and of hard work. But if we don't know even a little bit the life of a farmer, you're going to miss some of the most significant illustrations in the Bible. And I could do an entire lesson just on the farming illustrations. Let me just highlight one of them for our purposes here. One of those repeated illustrations focuses on time. There is always a gap of time between the sowing and the reaping. The farmer sows with a long-term goal in mind. He works after sowing in the spring and the summer, knowing that the fall is coming. He works and works with the goal in mind. This is a model we are given for taking on tasks in the Christian life. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 gives us Christ as an example for us to follow in living this way. Listen to it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. What do we see in just these 2 verses? First, we see the joy that was set before him. It was the long view, the farmer's view, that drew the concentrated focus of Jesus. It positioned him to endure the cross, despising the shame. Jesus was able to work in the spring and the summer because harvest was coming in the fall. The joy of the destination helped Jesus be empowered for the course of the journey. And then, in this picture that we see, this example, we see that this approach calls us to lay aside all barriers. The call on those who would follow Christ is to lay aside all that would hinder us. If it's not helping you run faster and harder after Christ, then it's hindering you from doing so. Lay it aside. Let it not cling to you. Rather, run in a way that you have endurance. Now, I want to take that lesson that we see by following this example of Christ, and I want to apply that to fellowship. And I've got a number of ways that we're going to do that. And I'm calling this fellowshipping on purpose. Laying aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely is living Christianity on purpose. Left to itself, our life would be forever connected to hindrances and to obstacles. We get magnetized to them. However, when we live on purpose, we navigate the obstacles. We keep our eye on the prize, and we do this with fellowship as well, because left to itself, fellowship would be intruded upon by distraction after distraction, excuse after excuse. We would allow life's worries, life's circumstances to keep us from fellowship, and we would never achieve fellowship. And brothers and sisters, we are called to something higher than living life in the world's relational inertia. We're called to something greater than what the busy schedules of our neighbors can deliver. We're called to lay it all aside and to pursue the kind of life that lives for the long haul. We're called to meaningful fellowship. And what are some things that we might need to lay aside? What things face us now in our culture in these times that might need to be laid aside? Here's the first one. Laying aside time for fellowship. We all have the same amount of time available to us each week. You do, I do, Jesus did. It's the same amount of time. It works out to 168 hours a week. Roughly speaking, a third of that is sleeping. That leaves 112 hours. Again, roughly speaking, if you happen to work full time, that leaves 67 hours or so left. In those 67 hours, we find time for eating, which is a good thing, but we also find time for our pastimes, our hobbies. We find time to run our kids to sports or dance classes, to watch sports ourselves. Are we faithfully laying aside time for fellowship? We can. It's possible in those 67 hours to prioritize fellowship if we value it highly enough. If the goal is a healthy Christian life as God designed it, then it will lay aside time. We will lay aside time for fellowship. Next, we lay aside preferences for fellowship. Perhaps you prefer more of a Bible study, and the community group closest to you is more of a discussion and prayer group. A friend suggests, well, why don't you go to a different community group? But you have a strong preference for the one that's closer to your home. You don't want to drive that far. And since the one closest to home isn't exactly as you prefer, you don't often attend. Or perhaps your preference is the further one, and after a hard day's work, it's just too far to make it. Friends, let's humble ourselves to examine how our preferences govern us more than truth may govern us. Let's be willing to lay aside preferences so that God's call to invest in fellowship has a stronger governing influence over us than our preferences do. Let's lay aside preferences for the sake of fellowship. Next, laying aside neatness for fellowship, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. When we get involved in other people's lives, it means that we get involved in other people's messes. We don't even like the messes in our own lives. Do we really want to invite additional messes? And the truth of the matter is that relationships bring blessing and relationships bring mess. Fellowship brings grace, though, into the mess. For it all to work well, fellowship will call you to be the vehicle to bring grace into others' messes. For fellowship to thrive, we need to be willing to lay aside our desire for neatness and embrace messiness. And let me just say here that it's also important to invite others into our own messes. Lastly, laying aside the short term for the long term, for the sake of fellowship. You remember the farmer taking on the labor in the short term for the harvest in the long term. You remember Jesus, whose eyes are set on the joy at the end of the path, giving endurance to keep going through the journey. Brother or sister, as you consider pressing further into fellowship, keep your eyes on the long term. There's fruit and strength and grace and faith and lifelong relationship in the harvest of fellowship if we'll just do the work now of sowing and weeding and watering, working the ground of fellowship for that harvest. It requires labor in the spring and the summer. But focus your eyes because the harvest comes. And this takes us full circle all the way back to the first of these 4 messages on fellowship. To endure through unpleasantness, the harvest needs to be something we desire, has to be something we recognize we have a significant need for. We need fellowship. We're made for fellowship by a wise and loving God. We are each gifted for fellowship by the powerful Spirit. And we're called to press into fellowship. Consider having someone over your home for dinner. And if when you're watching this, we're still in quarantine and we're still not able to be in each other's homes, I'll tell you, our family has invited some people over for Zoom dinners where we've put it at the screen at the end of our table while we're eating dinner and they're eating dinner in their house. We get to enjoy conversation, connect with others regardless of the obstacles. Get to know what makes those people tick. Learn the names of their children. Discover what weighs down their hearts. And hoping they're willing, share your own burdens, your own prayer requests, your own family memories with them. And then continue walking together. After someone shares a prayer request in a community group or during one of those times of personal fellowship, make a note to yourself, set a reminder in your phone, follow up with them. Show care that you're carrying their burdens on your own heart. And be sure to encourage one another, even more, as Hebrews tells us, as the day of the Lord's return approaches. Listen, thank you for giving time out of your community group this spring to this series. Remember, the goal is not just to teach, but for every dear saint that was purchased by the blood of Christ to know the full Christian life that God has designed for you. We are made for meaningful community. We are made for one another because we are members of one another. I do hope this series has blessed you, and I hope now, as you turn to discussion, that God would meet you richly in it. May God bless you guys.